Picture this: a quiet hillside in medieval Europe where the stones of an ancient abbey lie broken and forgotten. The wind whistles through its empty halls, carrying away the last whispers of monks who once labored over precious manuscripts. At first glance, it seems like just another ruin lost to time. But hidden in this crumbling scene is a startling truth. The collapse of this single abbey didn't just mark an ending, it ignited a revolution. A revolution of ideas, of knowledge, of how the medieval world understood itself. And today, we're going to unravel how something as ordinary as a falling building could send ripples across centuries, transforming the very fabric of history. Think about the books you've read, the lessons you've learned, the way knowledge travels so effortlessly today. Now imagine a world where every scrap of wisdom had to be painstakingly copied by hand, where a single fire or invasion could erase entire libraries forever. That was the fragile reality of medieval Europe, a place where knowledge was as precious as gold and just as vulnerable. So when an abbey fell, it wasn't just walls that collapsed. It was a vault of learning, a beacon of thought vanishing in an instant. But here's the twist: sometimes destruction creates as much as it takes away. Because when those manuscripts scattered, when those monks were forced to flee, they carried their knowledge with them, sparking a chain reaction no one could have predicted. This is the story of how loss became a catalyst, how the fall of one humble abbey didn't bury knowledge but set it free, sending scholars scrambling to preserve what remained and inspiring new ways to share ideas. It's a tale of resilience, of unexpected connections, and of how the medieval world began to stitch itself back together, not with mortar and stone, but with words and wisdom. By the time we're done, you'll see ruins in a whole new light, because sometimes the end of one thing is just the beginning of something extraordinary. So let's step into the shadows of that fallen abbey and discover how its collapse lit a fire that would illuminate the ages. To understand the true impact of this abbey's fall, we first need to step back into its golden age, a time when its halls hummed with the quiet intensity of scholars at work. Picture a dimly lit scriptorium where rows of monks bent over wooden desks, their quills scratching against parchment in a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. Here, in this unassuming space, the legacy of ancient Greece and Rome was painstakingly preserved, one stroke of ink at a time. Treatises on astronomy, medicine, and philosophy that might have been lost forever were instead copied, annotated, and safeguarded like buried treasure. The Abbey wasn't just a repository of knowledge, it was a living bridge between the classical world and the medieval mind. But this intellectual haven didn't exist in a vacuum. Beyond the Abbey's walls, the world was shifting. Trade routes were expanding, towns were growing, and the feudal order that had sustained monastic life for centuries was beginning to fray. Local lords, once generous patrons, now eyed the abbey's wealth with greed. Kings and popes clashed over authority, pulling monks into political crossfires. Even the weather turned against them. Crop failures and harsh winters strained resources, leaving roofs unrepaired and walls to crumble. The very people who'd once flocked to the abbey for learning now whispered about its decline. Yet inside the scriptorium, the work continued. A monk might pause to rub his aching fingers, glancing at the cracks spider webbing across the ceiling, but then he'd return to his task. There was an unspoken urgency in the air, as if they sensed time was running out. They copied faster, dug deeper into forgotten texts, even experimented with new inks to make their work last. It's heartbreaking to realize they were right. the golden age was already slipping away, not with a dramatic siege or fire, but with a slow, quiet unraveling, a missed harvest here, a diverted donation there. The Abbey's greatest strength, its isolation, had become its fatal weakness. Cut off from the changing world, it was like a lighthouse whose beacon grew fainter with each passing year. And then, one day, the walls gave way. Maybe it was a storm or just the weight of neglect, but when the roof caved in, it wasn't just stones that fell. Centuries of accumulated wisdom, original commentaries, unique translations, maps of the stars, were buried in the rubble. Yet in a cruel twist of fate, this disaster would become the spark that lit a fire across Europe. Because the monks who survived didn't just mourn their loss, they packed what manuscripts they could salvage and set out into a world that was suddenly hungry for the very knowledge their abbey had hoarded. The collapse wasn't an ending. It was the moment their precious work finally escaped the walls that had once protected it and doomed it. The cracks in the abbey's foundation weren't just physical. They were the silent symptoms of a deeper decay. Year after year, the careful balance that had sustained this sanctuary of learning began to tilt. Where once wealthy nobles competed to donate lands and gold in exchange for spiritual prestige, now their descendants saw little value in funding a remote community of scribes. Coffers that had overflowed now echoed empty. Without those vital resources, roofs leaked, ink grew scarce, and the once meticulous gardens where medicinal herbs were cultivated withered into weeds. But money wasn't the only thing slipping away. As bustling market towns sprang up along trade routes, they offered something the isolated abbey couldn't: connection. Young monks who might have spent lifetimes copying texts now heard whispers of universities taking root in cities like Paris and Bologna, where ideas collided in thrilling new ways. One by one, the brightest minds packed their few belongings and left, lured by the promise of debate, discovery, and a world beyond cloistered walls. Those who remained found themselves stretched thin, juggling the daily labor of survival with the increasingly hopeless task of preserving centuries of knowledge alone. Worst of all, the Abbey's troubles weren't just external. Petty squabbles over leadership fractured the once united community. Some argued they should abandon tradition and sell manuscripts to stay afloat. Others clung desperately to old ways, refusing to adapt even as the world changed around them. The very isolation that had once shielded their work now blinded them to their own decline. Like a candle burning at both ends, the Abbey was consuming itself. Yet in this slow unraveling lay an unexpected irony. The same forces starving the Abbey, the rise of cities, the hunger for new ideas, were creating audiences for the very knowledge it guarded. As its walls crumbled, the precious manuscripts within would find their way into hands that didn't just preserve wisdom, but multiplied it. The end of this abbey wouldn't be the end of learning. It would be the moment that learning finally broke free. The final blow came not with a grand battle or a king's decree, but with something as ordinary as a winter storm. One fierce night, wind howled through the abbey's weakened timbers, and the ancient roof, already sagging from years of neglect, finally gave way. Stones tumbled like dice, crushing shelves of manuscripts beneath them. Rain poured in, turning ink into blurred ghosts on parchment. Yet amid the wreckage, a strange alchemy began. What the storm destroyed, it also scattered. Monks who had spent decades copying texts now became unlikely couriers of knowledge, stuffing salvaged manuscripts into satchels as they fled. A farmer, drawn by curiosity to the ruins, might pocket a water-stained page on herbal remedies, carrying it to the local healer. A traveling merchant, poking through debris for anything valuable, could stumble upon a fragment of Aristotle's logic, and suddenly, a scrap of ancient wisdom found its way to a bustling town square. The Abbey's greatest treasures, once hoarded like relics, were now loose in the world. This wasn't just survival, it was transformation. In the scriptorium, knowledge had been static, carefully preserved, but rarely questioned. Now, as pages fluttered into new hands, they sparked debates in taverns, inspired experiments in apothecaries, even found their way into the lectures of university scholars. A monk's meticulous copy of Euclid's geometry, once destined to gather dust on a cloister shelf, might now help a master builder design a cathedral's vault. The very act of scattering made the ideas come alive, and here's the beautiful irony: the Abbey's collapse achieved what its founders never could. For centuries, they'd believed protecting knowledge meant shielding it from the world. But true preservation required the opposite: not walls to keep wisdom in, but roads to carry it outward. The storm that shattered the Abbey didn't erase its legacy. It set that legacy free, one battered page at a time. Imagine a single manuscript, its edges frayed, its ink faded, tucked into a merchant's saddlebag as he leaves the Abbey ruins behind. What was once destined to sit untouched on a shelf now bounces along muddy roads, passing through towns where no monk had ever preached. This was the accidental genius of the Abbey's collapse. Its books didn't just survive, they traveled. And with every mile, they escaped the quiet devotion of the cloister for the noisy, hungry minds of the wider world. Universities were among the first to seize this unexpected windfall. In places like Oxford and Padua, professors who had relied on fragments of ancient texts suddenly held complete works in their hands. A single rescued copy of Aristotle's Physics could revolutionize an entire curriculum, turning whispered theories into robust debates. Students no longer had to take a master's word as gospel. They could read the original, argue with it, even build upon it. The classroom, once a place of rote repetition, crackled with new energy. But it wasn't just scholars who benefited. Take Galen's medical texts, for instance. A traveling physician might barter for a water-damaged page on anatomy, then use it to refine his treatments. Apothecaries cross-referenced monastic herbals with local remedies, creating hybrid knowledge that saved lives. Even illiterate craftsmen absorbed ideas indirectly, as guild masters read aloud from salvaged engineering manuals, inspiring innovations in architecture and mechanics. The most surprising adopters, though, were the power brokers. King's advisors pored over rediscovered Roman legal codes, realizing they could centralize authority like the Caesars had. Merchant princes studied classical economics, grasping concepts like supply and demand centuries before Adam Smith. What monks had preserved as sacred duty, the secular world weaponized as strategy. Yet this dispersal wasn't neat or orderly. Pages went missing, translations mutated, and sometimes a single sentence from a lost text would surface in 3 different cities with 3 different interpretations. Chaos, it turned out, was the perfect incubator for creativity. A misread passage about astronomy might lead a scholar down a new path of inquiry. A fragment of poetry could inspire an entire artistic movement. The imperfections of the process didn't corrupt knowledge, they enriched it like a forest growing back stronger after a fire. And that's the real lesson here. The Abbey's collapse didn't just move books from one place to another. It shattered the old idea that wisdom belonged to any one group. Knowledge, when set free, doesn't dissipate, it multiplies. The scribes who'd copied those texts in isolation could never have imagined their work would one day fuel revolutions in science, law, and art. But that's the power of letting ideas outgrow their origins. The quiet scriptoriums of monasteries could no longer contain the hunger for knowledge that now pulsed through Europe. As salvaged manuscripts from the fallen abbey trickled into cities, they ignited an intellectual wildfire. Suddenly, the idea of gathering scholars under one roof, not to cloister them away, but to set their minds alight through debate seemed not just possible, but necessary. In Bologna, law students clustered around annotated copies of Justinian's Code, arguing late into the night about property rights and governance. Paris became a battleground of ideas where theologians wrestled with rediscovered Aristotelian logic, their heated discussions spilling from lecture halls into taverns. These weren't just schools, they were intellectual marketplaces, buzzing with an energy the isolated Abbey had never known. What made these new universities revolutionary wasn't just their curriculum, but their very structure. Unlike monastic schools bound by religious obedience, these were guilds of the mind, where masters and students negotiated terms like craftsmen setting apprenticeship fees. A professor's reputation rose or fell on his ability to captivate audiences. If his lectures grew dull, students would literally vote with their feet, marching to rival teachers across town. This competitive spirit turned learning into something dynamic, even theatrical. Imagine the scene: a star lecturer pacing before hundreds, brandishing a newly acquired manuscript like a prophet with sacred scripture, while students scribbled notes on wax tablets, desperate to capture every insight. The monastic monopoly had kept knowledge static, treating texts as relics to venerate, but universities treated them as puzzles to solve. When medical students in Salerno pored over Galen's works, now available thanks to rescued Abbey copies, they didn't just memorize his anatomy lessons. They tested them against dissections, sometimes proving the ancient master wrong. Legal scholars in Bologna didn't merely copy Roman law, they adapted it to contemporary disputes between emperors and popes. This was knowledge put to work, reshaped by each generation like clay on a potter's wheel. Yet the greatest innovation wasn't in the lecture halls, but in the streets around them. Booksellers set up stalls near universities, producing cheaper, more accessible copies of texts once reserved for elite monks. Stationers hired teams of scribes to meet student demand, creating Europe's first mass-market publishing industry. Even the humble textbook was born. Here teachers began dictating standardized commentaries so students could focus on debate rather than frantic copying. The Abbey's carefully guarded treasures were now commodities, bought and sold in a thriving marketplace of ideas. Ironically, the very institution that had safeguarded learning through the Dark Ages became obsolete in this new world. Monasteries still produced beautiful illuminated manuscripts, but their output couldn't match the furious pace of university scriptoria. Where monks had taken years perfecting a single volume, urban workshops could produce dozens in months. The Abbey's fall hadn't just dispersed knowledge, it had democratized it, shifting the center of intellectual life from secluded cloisters to vibrant, messy cities where ideas collided and cross-pollinated. This transformation came with growing pains, of course. Church authorities initially viewed universities with suspicion, banning certain Aristotelian texts as dangerous. Town gown riots erupted when students, often rowdy teenagers far from home, clashed with local merchants, but the genie couldn't be put back in the bottle. By the 13th century, universities were granting degrees recognized across Christendom, creating an international class of scholars who spoke the common language of Latin. A student could begin his studies in Oxford, debate in Paris, and teach in Naples, carrying fragments of the fallen Abbey's legacy further than its monks ever dreamed. The true measure of this revolution lies in what happened next. From these turbulent, competitive universities emerged minds like Thomas Aquinas, who synthesized faith and reason, and Roger Bacon, who championed experimental science. The institutional framework they studied under, lectures, degrees, academic freedom, still shapes education today, all because a scattered trove of manuscripts found its way to places where knowledge wasn't just preserved, but challenged, improved, and set free to grow. The abbey had been a fortress, the universities became greenhouses. The monks who had spent lifetimes copying texts in silent devotion now watched as their life's work took on a life of its own, no longer confined to candlelit scriptoriums, but shouted across crowded lecture halls, scribbled in student taverns, even debated in bustling market squares. The shift was staggering. Where once knowledge had flowed in one direction, from sacred text to obedient scribe, now it ricocheted between scholars, merchants, and craftsmen, morphing with each new conversation. The Abbey's meticulous copies, designed to freeze wisdom in time, had instead become kindling for an intellectual blaze no one could control. Take the case of Peter Abelard, the rock-star philosopher of 12th century Paris. A monk by training but a rebel by nature, he didn't just lecture on ancient texts, he tore them apart. His fiery public debates over Aristotle's logic drew crowds so large they spilled into the streets. Students flocked to him not for quiet piety, but for the thrill of watching him dismantle traditional interpretations with razor-sharp reasoning. This wasn't just teaching, it was performance, a far cry from the hushed reverence of monastic study. And Abelard was no outlier. All across Europe, a new breed of scholar emerged, men who earned their living not through prayer, but through persuasion, their reputations rising or falling on their ability to captivate audiences hungry for fresh ideas. The monks hadn't just lost their monopoly on knowledge, they'd lost control of its very meaning. In the Abbey, a text's authority came from its age and sanctity. But in the university, truth was forged in the crucible of argument. A student might challenge a professor's reading of a rescued manuscript, citing contradictions in another text salvaged from a different ruin. Rival schools clashed over interpretations, their followers turning academic disputes into street brawls. Knowledge was no longer something to be received, it was something to be fought over, a living thing that grew through friction. Yet the most radical change wasn't in how ideas were debated, but who got to debate them. Monastic education had been exclusive, reserved for those willing to devote their lives to religious vows. But universities threw open the doors to anyone who could pay tuition: merchants' sons, minor nobles, even the occasional ambitious peasant. Latin, once the sacred language of the cloister, became the vernacular of this new intellectual class, a linguistic leveling that let a student from England argue theology with a professor from Spain. The Abbey's treasures, once accessible only to the initiated, now belonged to anyone bold enough to wrestle with them. This democratization came with growing pains, of course. Traditionalists railed against uppity scholars who dared question church doctrine. Town residents grumbled about rowdy students turning their cities upside down. But the genie wouldn't go back in the bottle. By the 13th century, the most sought-after professors weren't holed up in monasteries, they were jet-setting intellectuals, lured from one university to another with promises of higher salaries and bigger audiences. Knowledge had become a commodity, its value measured not in divine revelation, but in its power to provoke, to inspire, to change minds. And here's the delicious irony: the monks' own devotion had made this revolution possible. Their painstaking copies, created to last an eternity, had survived wars, fires, and the Abbey's collapse precisely because they were so meticulously crafted. Now those same pages, passed from hand to hand, were being annotated, critiqued, even defaced with counter-arguments in the margins. What the scribes had meant as an act of preservation had become an invitation to conversation. Quietest work of the Middle Ages had given birth to its noisiest, most exhilarating invention: the idea that truth wasn't found in solitude, but in the glorious, messy clash of competing minds. Long before the clatter of Gutenberg's press echoed through Europe, a quieter revolution was already unfolding in dimly lit workshops and bustling market stalls. The Abbey's scattered manuscripts didn't just survive, they multiplied, as a new class of secular scribes seized the opportunity to meet the exploding demand for books. These weren't monks copying for salvation, but craftsmen working for profit, their quills flying across parchment at speeds that would have horrified their cloistered predecessors. In cities like Paris and Florence, scriptoria sprang up like bakeries, their shelves stacked not with sacred texts alone, but with law manuals, medical treatises, and even vernacular poetry. The very act of copying had been transformed from a spiritual duty into a commercial enterprise, and that shift changed everything. The pace was staggering. Where a monastic scribe might take a year to produce a single flawless Bible, urban workshops could turn out dozens of texts in months by dividing labor like an assembly line. One scribe copied the main text, another added rubrics for headings, a third proofread, while illustrators dashed off decorative initials. Efficiency became the watchword, with standard abbreviations slashing copying time and cheaper parchment making books more accessible than ever. The Abbey's treasures, once reserved for the privileged few, were now being mass-produced for students, professionals, and even the occasional literate merchant. Knowledge wasn't just escaping the cloister, it was becoming a commodity, but this explosion of copies came with a fascinating side effect: error. Monastic scribes had treated every letter as sacred, but secular copyists prioritized speed over perfection. A missed word here, a creative interpretation there. These corruptions might have horrified the Abbey's elders, but they inadvertently fueled innovation. A mistranslated passage from an Arabic medical text could send physicians down new paths of experimentation. A misread mathematical diagram might inspire fresh approaches to architecture. The messy, human process of copying became its own kind of collaboration across time, with each generation adding accidental improvements to the work of the last. The real game changer, though, was the rise of the vernacular. Monks had copied almost exclusively in Latin, the language of the Church. But as lay scribes took over, they began translating texts into Italian, French, and German, effectively breaking knowledge out of its elitist cage. Suddenly, a wool merchant's daughter could read a medical treatise, or a stonemason might puzzle over geometry. This linguistic democratization created something unprecedented, a public sphere of ideas where learning wasn't locked behind the priesthood's Latin gate. By the time Gutenberg put movable type to parchment in the 15th century, Europe was already primed for revolution. The Abbey's collapse had seeded the soil, proving that knowledge thrived when set free. The printing press didn't create the hunger for books, it merely fed an appetite that had been growing for centuries. Those first printed volumes didn't feel like a rupture, but a continuation. After all, what was a printing press if not the ultimate scribe, copying not just one book at a time, but hundreds? The monks who'd once guarded their manuscripts so fiercely could never have imagined their legacy would one day roll off a press in waves, flooding the world with the very wisdom they'd tried so hard to contain. Buried beneath the Abbey's rubble lay not just religious texts, but long-neglected scientific treasures, yellowed pages filled with Arabic star charts, Greek diagrams of pulleys and levers, and painstakingly copied medical observations. These weren't mere curiosities, they were time capsules of human ingenuity waiting for the right moment to breathe again, and when the walls fell, that moment arrived. Suddenly, a scholar in Padua could hold a 9th-century Baghdad astronomer's notes on planetary motion, while a Parisian physician puzzled over Galen's theories with fresh eyes. The Abbey's collapse didn't just redistribute knowledge, it reanimated it, turning dormant ideas into live wires that jolted the medieval mind awake. Consider the fate of one particular manuscript, Alhazen's Book of Optics, a groundbreaking Arabic work that had languished in the Abbey's library for generations. Its pages explained how light traveled in straight lines, how refraction bent vision, even how the eye itself functioned, concepts that might as well have been magic to most Europeans. But when this text resurfaced in the hands of a curious Franciscan friar named Roger Bacon, it became a revelation. Bacon didn't just read Alhazen, he tested him, using prisms and lenses to verify every claim. What started as a rescued book became the foundation for modern optics, all because its ideas finally escaped the shelf where they'd been imprisoned. The same transformation happened in medicine. Monks had dutifully copied Hippocrates' theories for centuries, treating them as sacred dogma. But when these texts reached the fledgling medical school at Salerno, students did the unthinkable. They compared the ancient Greeks' words to actual human dissections. When the descriptions didn't match, they didn't dismiss their eyes, they questioned the text. This simple act of defiance, trusting observation over authority, was the spark that would eventually kindle the scientific method. Astronomy saw perhaps the most dramatic shift. Ptolemy's Almagest, with its intricate models of celestial spheres, had been preserved in Abbey libraries like a relic. But when these diagrams reached independent thinkers like Nicole Orsme, they weren't treated as gospel. Orsme spotted inconsistencies, suggesting heretically that maybe Earth rotated daily, not the stars. It was a wobble in the medieval worldview, a crack that would widen until Copernicus shattered it entirely. None of this could have happened if these texts had remained locked away, revered but unexamined. The true brilliance of this revival lay in its unpredictability. A scrap of Euclid's geometry might inspire a mason to rethink cathedral arches. A fragment of Archimedes could lead a weaponsmith to design more powerful catapults. Knowledge, once set loose, didn't follow neat paths. It ricocheted between disciplines, creating collisions that birthed entirely new fields. The Abbey's monks had seen their work as preservation. They never imagined they were stocking the intellectual arsenal for revolutions yet to come. And that's the ultimate irony. The very institution that saved classical science by sheltering it also stifled it until disaster struck. The collapse forced these ideas into the light where they could be challenged, expanded, and ultimately transformed. What began as scattered pages ended as a new way of thinking. One that valued questions over answers, evidence over tradition, and the thrilling possibility that even the oldest truths might still be waiting to be proven wrong. The quiet certainty of monastic theology shattered like the Abbey's stained glass when its manuscripts flooded into the world. For centuries, religious thought had been a carefully tended garden pruned of weeds, uniform in its rows. A monk in Burgundy and a friar in Bavaria would interpret scripture almost identically, their understanding shaped by the same approved commentaries copied in identical scriptoria. But as the Abbey's scattered treasures reached universities and cathedrals, they revealed something startling. The Church's teachings weren't a single, unbroken thread, but a tapestry of competing interpretations woven across centuries and continents. Take the simple act of reading the Psalms. In the Abbey, monks chanted them in Latin, their meanings fixed by tradition. But when a scholar in Paris uncovered an ancient Greek version rescued from the ruins, he noticed discrepancies, words that changed the nuance of entire passages. Soon, professors were comparing Hebrew, Greek, and Latin texts side by side, realizing the eternal truths they'd studied might be translations of translations, filtered through generations of scribes. This wasn't just academic nitpicking. If Scripture's very wording was fluid, what did that mean for doctrines built upon it? The shockwaves reached the highest levels of the Church. Thomas Aquinas, wrestling with newly recovered works of Aristotle, dared to ask whether faith and reason might coexist, a radical notion when most theologians saw philosophy as a threat. His Summa Theologica didn't just answer questions, It taught students how to ask them, applying logic to mysteries like the Trinity that had once been accepted on pure faith. Meanwhile, in Oxford, Robert Grosseteste pored over rediscovered Greek science texts, suggesting the natural world itself was a book to be read alongside scripture. But the most explosive transformation came in how ordinary people engaged with faith. As vernacular translations of the Bible trickled out from university circles, lay readers, merchants, artisans, even some noblewomen began interpreting scripture for themselves. A cloth merchant in Flanders might debate predestination after reading Augustine's Confessions, while a Florentine banker's wife pondered Paul's letters in her own tongue. Theology was no longer the exclusive domain of cloistered scholars. It had become a living conversation in market squares and dinner tables. This democratization terrified church authorities. In 1219, the Council of Toulouse banned vernacular Bibles, fearing the little foxes of misinterpretation, but the genie was out of the bottle. 2 centuries later, when Jan Hus and Martin Luther called for reform, they stood on the shoulders of scholars who'd first dared to question, men whose doubts had been nurtured by those very manuscripts the Abbey had tried so hard to protect. The ultimate irony, the monks who'd copied these texts believed they were defending orthodoxy. Yet by preserving alternative voices, Augustine's mystical leanings, Jerome's scholarly rigor, even the heretical musings of Origen, they'd unknowingly stocked an arsenal for future reformers. The Abbey's fall didn't create these tensions, but it forced them into the light, proving that even the most sacred truths grow stronger when tested by wind and weather. What began as scattered pages ended as a revolution of the soul, one that would forever change how humanity wrestled with the divine. At first glance, medieval merchants and crumbling abbeys seem like opposites, one thriving in bustling market towns, the other fading into rural silence. Yet when the Abbey's manuscripts spilled into the world, they found eager buyers in these very traders. Picture a Florentine wool merchant haggling over a salvaged copy of Pliny's Natural History, not because he cared about ancient Rome, but because owning it whispered something powerful. This was no ordinary shopkeeper. He was a man of learning, a patron of art, worthy of rubbing shoulders with nobles who'd once dismissed his kind as coin counters. What began as status symbols soon became something far more transformative. Merchant guilds, tired of relying on clergy to draft contracts, started hiring scribes to train their sons in reading and arithmetic. Ship captains carried navigational charts based on rediscovered Ptolemaic maps, plotting safer routes to Venetian trading posts. Even account books evolved as Arabic numerals rescued from Abbey libraries replaced clumsy Roman ones, letting traders calculate profits at a glance. The written word, once the church's sacred tool, now greased the wheels of commerce, but the real revolution happened in the shadows of these transactions. A spice trader might commission a copy of Marco Polo's travels, then lend it to a shipbuilder hungry for designs of Chinese junks. A banker's wife, gifted a psalter, could secretly read Paul's letters in her own tongue and question why women couldn't preach. Knowledge once locked in Latin, now adapted to local dialects: Italian for contracts, French for love poetry, German for herbal remedies. The Abbey's treasures weren't just being sold, they were being translated, literally and culturally, into the language of everyday life. By the 14th century, the most unexpected libraries bloomed in merchant palaces. The Medici's collection in Florence included not just ledgers, but works by Plato and Euclid, some purchased from monasteries desperate for cash after the Black Death. In Bruges, a cloth merchant's will listed 27 books, from medical texts to bawdy fabliaux, all shelved beside his trading records. These men weren't scholars, yet their hunger for learning reshaped Europe's intellectual landscape. When Cosimo de' Medici funded the first public library since antiquity, he wasn't imitating monks, he was surpassing them, turning knowledge from a guarded privilege into a civic pride. The irony would have stunned the Abbey's founders. Their painstaking copies, meant to glorify God, now adorned the homes of men who measured wealth in silks and spices. Yet in this unlikely marriage of commerce and learning lay the seeds of the modern world. The merchant's ledger and the scholar's manuscript, once strangers, now shared the same desk, and together they were writing a new chapter of history. The moment those salvaged manuscripts escaped the Abbey's walls, they demanded a new kind of interpreter, someone who could speak the language of both parchment and people. Enter the public intellectual, a figure as revolutionary in the Middle Ages as the printing press would later become. These weren't scholars whispering in cloisters. They were men like Thomas Aquinas, whose Summa Theologica wasn't just for theologians but for anyone bold enough to wrestle with big questions. You could find his arguments being dissected in Parisian taverns, where students and merchants alike wagered opinions like dice, proving that deep thinking wasn't confined to sacred spaces anymore. What made these thinkers radical wasn't just their ideas, but their audience. Roger Bacon, the Franciscan friar who championed experimental science, didn't write in obscure Latin riddles. His Opus Majus laid out optics, astronomy, and even gunpowder's potential in language clear enough for a ship captain or a stonemason to grasp. This was knowledge without gatekeepers, where a butcher's son with a sharp mind could follow a debate about Aristotle's physics as easily as a nobleman. The Abbey's collapse hadn't just scattered books, it had demolished the old hierarchy that said wisdom belonged only to those who wore robes. The public intellectual thrived in this chaos. Take Christine de Pizan, the Venetian writer who turned a widow's hardship into a platform. Her City of Ladies defended women's intellect not in hushed convents, but in the vibrant vernacular, sparking debates from royal courts to weaving workshops. For the first time, thinkers were judged not by their piety but by their power to persuade. A scholar's reputation now hinged on his or her ability to captivate a crowd, whether that crowd sat in a university hall or gathered around a market stall. This shift reshaped knowledge itself. Monastic writing aimed for timelessness, preserving truths like insects in amber. But the new intellectuals wrote for the moment, their works alive with urgency. When Aquinas tackled whether usury was sinful, he wasn't just parsing scripture, he was responding to bankers' real dilemmas. Bacon's rants about alchemy's flaws weren't academic exercises, they were warnings to craftsmen wasting gold on false recipes. The best minds of the age had stopped talking to eternity and started talking to their neighbors. And here's the twist, the public intellectual didn't weaken learning by popularizing it, they made it stronger. By forcing complex ideas into the rough and tumble of public debate, they subjected them to a pressure no monastery could replicate. A theologian's argument might withstand the quiet scrutiny of a cloister, but could it survive a drunk student's heckling in an Oxford tavern? The Abbey's walls had protected knowledge, but they'd also shielded it from the very friction that polished it to brilliance. Now every idea had to prove its worth in the open air. The legacy of this revolution still echoes today. From TED Talks to Twitter threads, we expect thinkers to bridge the gap between expertise and everyday life. That demand wasn't born in Silicon Valley or the Enlightenment. It began when the first monk stepped out of the ruins with a satchel of manuscripts and realized the world was full of hungry minds waiting to be fed. Among the Abbey's scattered treasures were manuscripts presumed lost for centuries, texts so rare their very existence had faded into legend. A Benedictine monk fleeing the ruins might carry a satchel containing what he thought were simple psalms, unaware that tucked between the pages was a fragment of Livy's missing histories or a forgotten treatise by the Roman engineer Vitruvius. These weren't just old books, they were ghost stories given flesh, reappearing in the unlikeliest places. A merchant's trunk in Genoa could yield a water-stained copy of Sappho's poetry, salvaged from the debris and mistaken for a mundane prayer book until a curious scholar recognized its true worth. The thrill of these rediscoveries wasn't just in their rarity, but in the way they shattered assumptions. Take the commentary on Plato's Republic by the Neoplatonist philosopher Proclus. For generations, scholars had relied on second-hand summaries of his ideas until a fire in a Catalan monastery revealed a surviving copy hidden beneath a floorboard. Suddenly, medieval thinkers grappled with concepts that challenged Aristotle's dominance, sparking debates about ideal societies and the nature of justice that echoed in university halls from Oxford to Krakow. A text dismissed as lost had been quietly waiting like a seed buried in winter soil, ready to sprout when the conditions were right. Even more astonishing were the accidental survivals. A crumbling codex of herbal remedies, tossed aside as useless during the Abbey's evacuation, might resurface in a physician's workshop in Salerno, its margins filled with annotations from Arabic and Jewish doctors, creating a palimpsest of cross-cultural knowledge. Or consider the fate of Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy, a work so widely copied that its survival seemed assured. Yet when scholars compared versions, they realized the Abbey's copy contained passages missing elsewhere, variations that hinted at how much had been silently edited or lost over centuries of transcription. The lost works weren't always gone. Sometimes they were hiding in plain sight, disguised by familiarity. The greatest irony, many of these texts survived precisely because they were forgotten. While popular works like Augustine's City of God were copied to the point of wear, obscure treatises on geometry or meteorology sat undisturbed in the Abbey's deepest chests, shielded from the handling that destroyed their more famous cousins. Neglect became their salvation. When a Flemish antiquarian stumbled upon a pristine copy of Ptolemy's Geography in a nobleman's attic, its ink still vivid, its maps uncracked by age, it wasn't despite the Abbey's collapse, but because of it. The chaos of dispersal had scattered these hidden gems far from the wars and fires that consumed better-known libraries. What emerged from this upheaval was a new understanding of loss itself. The medieval world had assumed that survival required vigilant protection, that knowledge needed walls. But the Abbey's story taught the opposite. Sometimes preservation demanded letting go. A single manuscript locked in a vault might vanish forever, but 100 copies scattered to the winds stood a chance that somewhere, somehow, at least one would endure. The texts that resurfaced weren't just artifacts. They were testaments to the stubborn resilience of ideas, proving that even in ruin, there's a kind of alchemy, one that turns disaster into discovery. Fragmentation turned out to be the Abbey's unexpected gift to the world. Where once its library stood as a monolithic fortress of knowledge, its sudden scattering created something far more dynamic, a constellation of ideas, each fragment taking root in different soils and growing into distinct shapes. Picture a single page from Aristotle's Metaphysics, salvaged by a fleeing monk and carried to a university in Paris, while another copy of the same text, stained by rainwater, found its way to a scholar in Bologna. Identical in origin, these pages soon bore the marks of their new homes. In Paris, the emphasis fell on theology, with professors weaving Aristotle's logic into proofs of God's existence. But in Bologna, the same words were read through the lens of law, reshaping theories of justice and governance. The text hadn't changed, but the minds interpreting it had, and that made all the difference. This divergence wasn't chaos, it was evolution. Just as a forest thrives when a storm scatters seeds to new terrain, intellectual life flourished when ideas escaped their singular, authoritative source. A medical text copied in Montpellier might be annotated with local herbal remedies, while the same treatise in Salerno incorporated observations from Arab physicians. The unity of medieval learning, once seen as its strength, revealed its limits. A single interpretation, preserved like a fly in amber, couldn't adapt. But fragments could. They mutated, hybridized, and in doing so, they grew stronger. Consider the fate of Euclid's Elements. In the Abbey, it had been a static masterpiece, revered but rarely questioned. Once dispersed, it became a living tool. Architects in Chartres used its geometry to refine cathedral arches, while Oxford mathematicians debated its axioms, laying groundwork for calculus centuries later. The same text, fragmented across Europe, became a dozen different books, each answering the unique needs of its new home. This wasn't distortion, it was dialogue. The most striking evidence of fragmentation's power lies in the margins. Unlike the pristine pages of monastic copies, these salvaged manuscripts bristled with annotations, objections, corrections, even doodles from students who couldn't resist scribbling in the margins. A single passage might be circled in red by one reader, underlined by another, and dismissed with a scoff in the cramped handwriting of a third. These marks weren't vandalism, they were the fingerprints of engagement, proof that knowledge wasn't just being received but contested. And here's the paradox: the Abbey's fall didn't dilute learning, it concentrated it. By forcing texts into new contexts, fragmentation created a kind of intellectual cross-pollination. A legal scholar in Padua might borrow methods from rediscovered Roman engineering manuals to analyze property laws. A poet in Provence could weave Aristotelian logic into love ballads. The walls between disciplines, once so rigid, began to crumble not because anyone planned it, but because ideas, once set loose, refused to stay in neat categories. What emerged was a medieval version of crowdsourcing, an entire continent refining, debating, and improving upon a shared inheritance. The Abbey had sought to protect knowledge by keeping it whole. But true preservation required the opposite, not unity but diversity, not one voice but many. The fragments that survived weren't broken, they were alive. Latin had been the sacred language of learning for centuries, the velvet rope that separated the educated elite from everyone else. But when the Abbey's manuscripts scattered across Europe, they landed in a world where merchants kept accounts in Italian, poets sang in Provençal, and craftsmen swapped techniques in German. Suddenly, the very people who'd been shut out of scholarship, the cloth dyers, the shipwrights, the apothecaries, found themselves hungry for knowledge they could actually understand. A Venetian glassblower didn't need Cicero's speeches in their original Latin. He needed instructions on Alexandrian glass techniques translated into the rough, vibrant tongue of the docks. This linguistic revolution didn't happen overnight. At first, translators worked in shadows, often risking accusations of heresy for rendering scripture into common speech. A monk in Normandy might secretly annotate a medical text with old French terms for diseases, while a Jewish scholar in Toledo bridged Arabic and Castilian with whispered precision. But as demand grew, so did boldness. By the 13th century, French King Philip Roman IV commissioned law codes translated, so that every man may know his rights, and Italian city-states paid scribes to turn Latin legal manuals into vernacular handbooks for notaries. Knowledge wasn't just spreading, it was shedding its aristocratic skin. The real breakthrough came when translators stopped treating vernacular as a poor cousin to Latin and embraced its raw power. Take Brunetto Latini, the Florentine diplomat who wrote his encyclopedia Les Livres du Tracer in French because, as he put it, the language is more delightful and more common to all people. His words crackle with the energy of a marketplace, turning Aristotle's ethics into advice a silk merchant could use. Or consider the Ménagier de Paris, a household guide that blended high-minded morality with practical tips on removing wine stains, proof that wisdom wasn't just for universities anymore. Science benefited most dramatically. Monastic Latin had turned Pliny's natural histories into stiff, reverential texts, but in the hands of vernacular translators, they became lively field guides. A Middle English version of the properties of things didn't just list herbs, it explained how to spot counterfeit cinnamon at market, while German renditions of surgical texts added local folk remedies to Galen's theories. This wasn't dumbing down, it was cross-pollination where book learning and street smarts fused into something new, even sacred texts transformed. Where Latin Bibles had been chanted like incantations, vernacular versions invited debate. A Yorkshire farmer's wife reading the Psalms in Middle English might notice contradictions the clergy had smoothed over. A Flemish weaver, puzzling through Exodus in his own tongue, could question why Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and did God force him to sin? The questions themselves were revolutionary. The Abbey's monks would have recoiled at this chaos. They'd copied Latin texts with devotional precision, believing the language itself held divine power. But in breaking that spell, the collapse unleashed something extraordinary, the realization that truth doesn't belong to any one tongue. Whether whispered in Arabic taverns, argued in German guild halls, or penned in Italian sonnets, knowledge kept its meaning and gained new dimensions. The walls that fell weren't just made of stone, they were built of words. The flow of gold tells the story best. Where once noblemen's purses opened for monasteries, funding scriptoria in exchange for prayers that eased their path to heaven, now those same coins clinked into the hands of university professors and freelance translators. A French count who might have donated a vineyard to Cluny Abbey in 1200 would, by 1350, endow a college at the University of Paris instead. This wasn't just a change in bookkeeping, it was a seismic shift in how power and prestige were measured. No longer content to be remembered as pious benefactors, Europe's elite wanted to be seen as champions of progress, their names etched not on abbey walls but in the dedication pages of groundbreaking medical treatises and legal commentaries. Cities became the new stages for this intellectual theater. In Bologna, law students mobbed the lectures of celebrity jurists like Accursius, whose interpretations of Roman law could make or break a nobleman's land claims. Wealthy families competed to house these scholars, offering cushy stipends and even tax exemptions, perks once reserved for monasteries. The message was clear: knowledge wasn't just a spiritual asset anymore, it was political currency. A king supporting a brilliant logician at Oxford could outmaneuver rivals relying on cloistered theologians. A merchant guild funding a mathematics chair in Florence saw returns in better accounting methods and navigational charts. Even the church adapted, with popes like Innocent Roman IV hiring legions of university-trained canon lawyers to centralize papal authority. The speed of this transformation would have stunned the Abbey's former patrons. Within decades, the very definition of learning had flipped. Where monastic education had emphasized timeless truths, urban scholarship prized novelty, the thrill of a fresh argument, the scandal of a challenged dogma. A lord might still fund a monk's quiet copying of Augustine, but he'd brag louder about sponsoring a disputation where his pet philosopher demolished Aristotelian orthodoxy. The intellectual center of gravity hadn't just shifted, it had electrified. Yet the most telling change was in the shadows. Independent scholars, neither monks nor tenured professors, began thriving in this new ecosystem. Take Richard of Wallingford, the clockmaker astronomer whose intricate designs for mechanical timepieces were bankrolled by a bishop eager to outshine rival dioceses. Or Trotula of Salerno, whose medical texts on women's health circulated in vernacular copies paid for by noble women tired of male physicians. These weren't isolated cases. A whole class of freelancers emerged, translating Arabic scientific texts for Italian merchants or composing legal manuals for German town councils. Knowledge work had become a profession, not just a vocation. The Abbey's collapse didn't cause this revolution, but it laid the crisis bare. When those crumbling walls forced patrons to choose between propping up a dying institution or betting on the future, their gold followed the energy, and the energy was in the cities. What began as a trickle of donations to university halls became a flood, financing libraries, laboratories, and lecture halls that would nurture minds like Galileo and Newton. The quiet piety of the cloister had served its purpose. Now, the noisy, competitive, gloriously messy world of urban learning took center stage and changed everything. Authority trembled as the Abbey's scattered manuscripts reached hands they were never meant to touch. For centuries, the Church had curated knowledge like a sacred flame, trusting only cloistered monks to tend its glow. But now that flame had leaped beyond the altar, igniting fires in taverns, market squares, and even peasant cottages. A weaver in Ghent could scrutinize scripture in Flemish, spotting contradictions between Christ's teachings and the bishop's demands. A cobbler's son in Cologne, armed with a salvaged logic text, might dismantle a priest's sermon point by point. The gates were open, and the gatekeepers were losing control. Take the case of Peter Waldo, a wealthy Lyon merchant who commissioned a vernacular Bible in the 12th century. What began as personal piety spiraled into rebellion when he shared translations with fellow laypeople. Soon, these Waldensians were preaching without priestly approval, their sermons drawn straight from texts the Church had reserved for Latin literate clergy. Bishops thundered against this presumption, but the genie wouldn't go back in the bottle. The more they banned unauthorized reading, the more people craved it, proving that forbidden knowledge burns brightest. Universities became battlegrounds where tradition clashed with innovation. When a young scholar named Siger of Brabant argued that Aristotle's philosophy might contradict church doctrine on the soul's immortality, the backlash was swift. Church councils condemned his radical Aristotelianism, and Thomas Aquinas himself was tasked with refuting him. Yet the very need for such rebuttals revealed a seismic shift. Ideas once confined to approved commentaries now erupted in open debate, with students cheering their champions like knights in a tournament. Truth was no longer handed down, it was wrestled over. Even the tools of dissent evolved. Marginal notes in rescued manuscripts show readers increasingly scribbling, "not so." Or where is the proof beside authoritative claims? A 13th century copy of Augustine's works now in Oxford's Bodleian Library bears one particularly defiant annotation: "This argument is weak as water." Such insolence would have been unthinkable in the Abbey's scriptorium, where every letter was copied with reverent precision. But in the messy marketplace of ideas, even church fathers faced cross-examination. The most explosive conflicts erupted over scripture itself. As vernacular Bibles spread, ordinary believers noticed discrepancies between the gospel's message of humility and the church's lavish wealth. In England, John Wycliffe's Lollard preachers argued that if the Bible belonged to all Christians, then popes and bishops had no special claim to interpret it. Their radical conclusion that every plowboy knew God's law as well as any priest sent shockwaves through the establishment. By 1415, the church would burn Wycliffe's follower Jan Hus at the stake, but his dying words, "Truth conquers all," echoed across Europe. The stakes were clear. This wasn't just about books, it was about who had the right to think. Ironically, the church's attempts to suppress dissent only fueled it. The Fourth Lateran Council's 1215 decree banning unauthorized Bible translations had the opposite effect, creating a thriving black market for smuggled vernacular texts. Inquisitors hunting heretical readers often found entire villages memorizing passages to avoid detection. Persecution, it turned out, was the best publicity. Yet the real revolution wasn't in the rebellions themselves, but in the quiet shifts they revealed. When a Florentine banker's wife hosted salons where merchants debated Dante's Divine Comedy alongside theological treatises, or when a Parisian stonemason quoted Aristotle to dispute his guildmaster, something profound had changed. Knowledge was no longer a monologue delivered from pulpit to pew. It was a conversation loud, messy, and impossible to silence. The Abbey's walls had not just kept people out. They'd kept ideas in, and now those ideas were roaming free, reshaping the world one argument at a time. The quiet devotion of monastic scribes had always looked backward, their quills meticulously tracing the wisdom of ancients, their greatest ambition to pass those words down unchanged. But in the hands of university scholars, those same texts became springboards rather than shrines. A rescued copy of Euclid's Geometry no longer just gathered dust on a cloister shelf. It inspired a Parisian master to question why parallel lines couldn't meet, planting seeds for non-Euclidean mathematics centuries later. Galen's medical theories, once copied with reverent precision, now faced live dissections in Salerno's anatomy theaters, where students pointed out errors in his descriptions of the human liver. The Abbey's collapse didn't just redistribute knowledge, it transformed how people used it. This shift from preservation to innovation crackled through every discipline. Law students in Bologna didn't just memorize Justinian's codes, they adapted them to contemporary trade disputes, creating hybrid legal theories that shaped modern contracts. Astronomers poring over Ptolemy's star charts didn't merely reproduce his calculations, they noticed discrepancies, tinkered with models, and laid groundwork for Copernicus's celestial revolution. Even theology, once the domain of unquestioned tradition, became a construction site. Thomas Aquinas took Aristotle's logic, a pagan philosopher's tool, and built upon it to prove Christian doctrines like the existence of God. What monks had treated as inviolable, scholars now treated as raw material. The tools of progress were often literal. Monastic scribes prized uniformity, every letter identical, every margin pristine. But university copies bristled with annotations, cross-references, and furious debates crammed into margins. A single page might bear 3 generations of commentary, each layer building on the last, turning static texts into living conversations. And when those pages wore out from handling, they weren't reverently rebound, they were scraped clean and reused, the old making way for the new. The most radical change, though, was in attitude. A Benedictine monk copying Augustine's Confessions would have shuddered at the thought of improving the saint's words. But by the 13th century, scholars like Robert Grosseteste openly revised ancient optical theories based on their own experiments with lenses. The goal was no longer just to conserve light from the past, but to refract it into new colors. This intellectual audacity had practical consequences. When Black Death ravaged Europe, it wasn't monastic herbal remedies that offered hope. It was university-trained physicians cross-referencing Arab medical texts with observations of their own patients. When cathedrals soared higher than ever, their vaults relied not on rote copying of Roman designs, but on geometric innovations tested in sketchbooks. Even warfare transformed, as engineers applied Archimedes' principles to build trebuchets capable of shattering castle walls. The Abbey's monks would have barely recognized this world. Their sacred duty had been to shield wisdom from time's corrosion, but the scholars who inherited their scattered treasures asked a different question. What if knowledge wasn't a relic to guard, but a foundation to build upon? The answer reshaped continents. Those who once preserved the past now raced toward the future, and the race had only just begun. The scriptorium's legacy clung to Europe's intellectual life like ink on parchment, subtle, indelible. Though the Abbey's walls had crumbled, the habits of those hunched scribes echoed in unexpected places. Early printers, for instance, didn't just adopt the monks' tools, they inherited their obsessions. Take the way Gutenberg's first printed Bible mimicked the exact layout of monastic manuscripts, complete with hand-painted initials and margins wide enough for annotations. This wasn't imitation, it was reverence. The scribe's painstaking attention to detail had set a standard so high that even a revolutionary technology bent to its precedent. Those blank spaces left for illuminations, they weren't just practical, they were a silent tribute to the belief that beauty mattered as much as content. Yet the scriptorium's true bequest wasn't aesthetic, it was intellectual. Universities might have rejected monastic isolation, but they embraced the Abbey's cult of precision. A law professor in Bologna dissecting Justinian's code with his students wasn't so different from a monk passing Augustine's sermons. Both treated texts as living things to be interrogated, not just recited. Even the humble footnote owes its existence to those medieval scribbles in abbey margins, where monks debated interpretations across generations. The scriptorium had taught Europe how to think with texts, not just about them. The most enduring twist, the very tools meant to preserve tradition became instruments of change. Monks had developed standardized abbreviations to save parchment little symbols for etc. or namely. Centuries later, those same shorthand marks streamlined early scientific correspondence, letting Galileo and Newton pack complex ideas into tight margins. The scriptorium's economy of space became the Royal Society's efficiency of thought. Even the humble bookmark, invented to keep a monk's place in his daily psalms, evolved into the numbered index, an innovation that would later help Copernicus cross-reference celestial observations with ancient star charts. Perhaps the greatest testament to the scriptorium's influence lies in what it didn't do. Monks had never intended to spark revolutions, they'd sought only to safeguard. Yet by treating every word as sacred, they'd unwittingly taught future generations that ideas deserved that same reverence whether carved in stone, inked on vellum, or pressed in type. The Abbey was gone, but its quiet discipline lived on wherever a scholar paused mid-sentence, weighing each syllable for the ages. Change doesn't always arrive with a bang. Sometimes it seeps in like morning fog, gradual and quiet until suddenly the landscape is transformed. The knowledge revolution sparked by the Abbey's collapse moved at the pace of a growing oak, imperceptible day by day, but over decades, its roots cracked foundations and its branches reshaped the sky. This wasn't a storm of upheaval, it was a slow tilting of the world's axis, where shifts in thought accumulated like layers of sediment, each generation building on the faint tremors left by the last. Consider the humble textbook a mundane object today, but a radical innovation in the 13th century. Before the Abbey's Manuscripts Scattered, learning meant memorizing a master's lectures or painstakingly copying texts word for word. But as rescued manuscripts reached universities, professors began dictating standardized commentaries, creating reproducible teaching tools that democratized access. A student in 14th century Paris could now hold the same set of notes as his counterpart in Prague, forging the first threads of a shared intellectual tradition. The change seemed small, just a tweak in classroom logistics, but it laid the groundwork for everything from modern curricula to the scientific method's emphasis on replicable results. Medicine tells a similar story of incremental revolution. A Salerno physician in 1190 might still swear by Galen's ancient theories passed down through monastic copies. Yet by 1350, his successor would be cross-referencing those same texts with observations from Arab medical manuals and his own dissections, noting discrepancies in the margins. No single eureka, a moment overturned centuries of dogma, just a persistent drip of questions, corrections, and tiny rebellions that eventually wore down the old certainties. The Abbey's collapse hadn't handed Europe a new science, it had given them permission to doubt. Even language transformed grain by grain. Latin's dominance didn't shatter overnight, but as vernacular translations of Abbey manuscripts trickled into cities, they created parallel streams of thought. A merchant reading Aristotle in Italian might grasp concepts differently than a cleric parsing the original Latin, sparking interpretations that diverged like branches from a trunk. By the time Dante penned his Divine Comedy in Florentine dialect, he wasn't just writing poetry, he was proving that profound ideas could thrive outside their sacred linguistic cages. The slowest burn of all was in the mind itself. The medieval worldview had been hierarchical, static. Truth flowed downward from God to pope to peasant. But as scattered manuscripts fostered debate, that pyramid began to wobble. A Parisian scholar's objection to Aquinas here, a Bolognese lawyer's novel interpretation there, these were barely noticeable tremors at first. Yet by the time Erasmus mocked clerical hypocrisy in Praise of Folly, or Galileo pointed his telescope at Jupiter's moons, the old order was already hollowed out, its authority eroded by centuries of whispered questions. What makes this glacial revolution so remarkable is its invisibility to those living through it. A monk fleeing the Abbey ruins in 1100 couldn't have imagined his salvaged manuscripts would inspire Luther's 95 Theses 4 centuries later. A scribe painstakingly correcting a mistranslated passage didn't know he was nudging open a door that would eventually lead to Newton's calculus. Yet each act of preservation, each spark of curiosity, was a stitch in an immense tapestry, one too vast for any single generation to see in full. The lesson here isn't just about patience, it's about the fractal nature of change. What begins as a barely perceptible shift, a book moving from a cloister to a classroom, a Latin phrase turning into a vernacular proverb, can ripple outward in ways no one anticipates. The Abbey's collapse didn't rewrite history in a day. It planted seeds that grew forests. The pattern is uncanny. Whenever knowledge escapes its carefully guarded containers, civilization takes a leap forward. The Abbey's collapse wasn't an isolated event. It was the first domino in a chain reaction that would repeat across centuries. Just as the dispersal of monastic manuscripts shattered the Church's monopoly on learning, the later breakdown of guild secrecy would unleash industrial innovation, and the printing press's rise would dismantle the scribe's privileged role. Each time the same alchemy occurs, centralized control fractures, expertise floods into new hands, and progress erupts in the most unlikely places. Take the guilds of the late Middle Ages. Like monasteries, they hoarded knowledge as trade secrets. A master locksmith might teach his apprentice just enough to craft a decent bolt, but never reveal the tricks that made his work extraordinary. This system preserved quality but stifled invention. Then came the factories of the Industrial Revolution, where fragmented guild knowledge collided with mechanization. A clockmaker's technique, once jealously guarded in a Nuremberg workshop, might now inspire improvements to a Lancashire textile loom. Specialized skills, once locked in silos, cross-pollinated, birthing hybrid technologies no single guild could have imagined. The parallels to the Abbey story are striking. Just as scattered monks carried manuscripts to universities, itinerant mechanics spread trade secrets between factories, turning scarcity into abundance. The scribe-to-printer shift reveals the same dynamic. For generations, scribes had been the gatekeepers of the written word, their painstaking labor making books rare and expensive. Then Gutenberg's press exploded that model, flooding Europe with affordable texts. At first, traditionalists mourned the loss of craftsmanship, just as Abbey elders had lamented the vulgarization of sacred texts. But the chaos bore fruit. Cheaper books meant more readers meant more ideas in circulation. A farmer's son with access to printed geometry might redesign his father's plow, while a midwife studying vernacular medical texts could challenge ancient superstitions. The printing press didn't just replicate the old system faster, it created an entirely new ecology of knowledge, just as the Abbey's fall had done centuries earlier. What links these transitions is the paradox of fragmentation. We assume stability preserves progress, but history shows the opposite. When expertise concentrates, it stagnates. The Abbey's meticulously copied manuscripts only sparked revolution when they escaped their velvet prison. Guild techniques only transformed industry when they leaked beyond apprenticeship oaths. Even today, we see this principle in open-source software, where shared code evolves faster than proprietary systems. The medieval monks couldn't have imagined their scattered library would one day foreshadow Wikipedia, yet the mechanism is identical. Break down the walls, and knowledge finds its own fertile ground. Perhaps the deepest lesson lies in what these shifts cost. Disruption is never painless. The Abbey's scribes lost their vocation. Guild masters watched their status crumble, and scribes became relics. Progress demands casualties, but the alternative is worse, a world where ideas, like insects in amber, are preserved perfectly but cease to live. The Abbey's fall forced Europe to choose between clinging to a dying model or embracing the messy, unpredictable tide of change. 500 years later, as we navigate our own knowledge revolutions, that choice still defines us. The walls we build around wisdom may keep it safe, but only by letting them fall can we watch it grow. Had the Abbey's walls never crumbled, its library might have become a time capsule sealed away from the very world it was meant to enlighten. Picture an alternate history where those manuscripts never scattered, where monks continued copying the same texts in perfect isolation, generation after generation. The knowledge would have been preserved, yes, but preserved like a fly in amber, pristine, unchanging, and utterly disconnected from the problems of a growing, shifting Europe. The tragedy isn't just what might have been lost, it's what might never have been found. Consider the fate of Aristotle's works, which had already spent centuries confined to monastic libraries before the Abbey's collapse. Without their dispersal, his ideas on logic and natural philosophy might have remained curiosities rather than catalysts. No Aquinas synthesizing faith and reason, no Buridan theorizing momentum, no groundwork for the scientific method. The Renaissance didn't emerge from perfect preservation. It grew from the friction of ancient ideas colliding with medieval minds. A surviving abbey could have been a dead end, its treasures revered but never wrestled with. Even more telling is what wouldn't have reached Europe's hungry thinkers. Arabic scientific texts, painstakingly translated in Toledo and Sicily, might never have traveled north without the disruption that sent monks fleeing across borders. The mathematical genius of Al-Khwarizmi, the medical insights of Avicenna, these weren't rediscovered through careful curation, but through chaos. The Abbey's rigid walls would have filtered out anything deemed too foreign or radical, leaving Europe cut off from half the world's knowledge. But the greatest cost of survival might have been to innovation itself. Universities thrived because they were messy, competitive places where ideas clashed like swords. A thriving abbey with its monopoly on manuscripts could have stifled that energy. Imagine a world where scholars still waited years to access a single copy of Galen, where dissenting opinions were smothered under layers of monastic orthodoxy. The printing press, when it finally came, might have faced fierce resistance from scriptoriums invested in the old ways. Progress doesn't just need preservation, it needs oxygen. Yet here's the twist: the Abbey's hypothetical survival also forces us to question our romance of disruption. What priceless works might have been saved from later destruction? The lost plays of Sophocles, the complete histories of Livy, if more libraries had stood firm. Perhaps the real lesson isn't that collapse was necessary, but that fragility is the price of control. The Abbey couldn't both safeguard knowledge and set it free. Its fall was a brutal reminder that ideas, like water, find their own level whether we're ready or not. The parallels between that crumbling medieval abbey and our digital age are almost eerie. We've built vast, glittering archives of knowledge, entire libraries that fit in our pockets, databases that dwarf the great library of Alexandria. Yet, like the monks who believed their walls protected wisdom, we risk repeating their fatal assumption that preservation equals progress. The real lesson of the Abbey isn't just about saving information, it's about setting it loose in the wild. Take Wikipedia, that chaotic miracle of collective knowledge. Early critics sneered that open editing would drown facts in misinformation, just as medieval clerics feared vernacular translations would corrupt scripture. But the opposite happened. Errors get corrected faster in the open air, where millions of eyes can scrutinize them, than they ever could in some locked vault. The Abbey's manuscripts only sparked revolutions when they escaped the scriptorium's hushed perfection. And today's breakthroughs happen when research papers leap from paywalled journals to preprint servers where anyone can build on them. Yet we're still wrestling with the same old demons. When universities hoard studies behind subscription fees, or when tech giants algorithmically silo information into echo chambers, they're playing the Abbey's doomed game, prioritizing control over circulation. The monks didn't realize their greatest treasures were the ideas they'd hidden too well. Are we any wiser? The most hopeful twist lies in disaster. Just as the Abbey's collapse forced knowledge into unpredictable hands, merchants, midwives, stonemasons, our own crises have a way of breaking open gates. During the pandemic, when paywalls around vaccine research crumbled overnight, scientists shattered records for collaborative breakthroughs. When Ukraine's libraries digitized their collections ahead of Russian bombs, they proved that fragility can be a strength, because a scattered idea is harder to kill than one locked in a vault. This isn't just about altruism, it's about survival. The monks thought they were protecting knowledge by keeping it still, but like a river that turns stagnant when dammed, wisdom only stays vital when it flows. Every open-source software project, every Creative Commons license, every citizen science initiative echoes the same truth. What's shared doesn't shrink, it multiplies. The Abbey's ruins whisper to us across centuries, reminding us that light doesn't come from building taller walls, but from daring to strike sparks in the dark. The fall of this single abbey wasn't just an end. It was a detonation that scattered embers of wisdom across a continent waiting to catch fire. Think of it like this: when a forest burns, the devastation seems absolute. But in the ash lies a hidden alchemy. Seeds that would have languished in the shade suddenly find sunlight. Soil once choked by undergrowth becomes fertile ground. The Abbey's collapse worked the same way. Its shattered scriptorium didn't bury knowledge, it planted it in places the monks could never have reached. What grew from those ruins was nothing short of a metamorphosis in how humanity handles ideas. Before, learning moved at the speed of a monk's quill, slow, deliberate, controlled. Afterward, it raced like a merchant's gossip, jumping from university halls to artisan workshops to royal courts. The Abbey had treated books as sacred objects. The world that followed saw them as tools, their value measured not by their perfection but by their power to solve problems. A crumbling page of Archimedes didn't belong behind glass. It belonged in the hands of an engineer calculating cathedral buttresses or a physician rethinking bloodletting. This transformation holds a provocative truth. Progress often demands sacrifice. The monks who wept as their life's work vanished into the wind couldn't have imagined that their greatest service wasn't in preserving texts, but in losing them. Like a parent watching a child leave home, their treasure only fulfilled its purpose when it outgrew them. The same paradox echoes through history. Libraries burn, empires fall, and from the wreckage, something unexpected emerges. The Renaissance didn't arise from unbroken tradition, but from the rediscovery of what had been forgotten. So as we step back from this story, let's ask not just what was lost, but what might still be waiting in the fragments. Beneath the rubble of other collapsed systems, abandoned factories, failed states, even outdated ideologies, could there be seeds of the next great awakening? The Abbey's lesson is clear. Sometimes the future isn't built by guarding the past, but by letting it break open. And if that thought excites you as much as it does me, I'd love to hear which historical ruins you think hold untapped revolutions. Drop your ideas below and let's keep the conversation alive. For more journeys into the hidden turning points of history, don't forget to hit subscribe. The past isn't finished surprising